Care. Um, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is my first trip to Wilmington, a place I wanted to come for some time. I finally got here. I'll come back again. It is, however, not my first trip to North Carolina. My first trip to North Carolina came when I was 3 months old. That's because my parents moved back to North Carolina. My father had been working in Washington, and if they or I or somehow had timed it better, I would have joined umpteen generations of my family being native Targians. But in fact, I was the first one in umpteen generations who wasn't. But for several years of my childhood, I did live here in North Carolina, and then we moved to Washington, D.C. My father wanted to go back and try his hand there. And one thing I had to do was learn to repronounce my name, because it's John Cooper. Nope, I had to learn to say Cooper. I remember a friend of mine once who was from Tennessee said, John, said, you say Cooper or Cooper? I said, Paul, I said, it depends on where I am and who I'm talking to. So, I'm also pleased to be here talking about the election of 1912 because there is, as many of you know, a Wilmington connection. One of the people who ran for president, the guy who won the election, had lived here at Wilmington, Woodrow Wilson. He had years as a student at Princeton and then as a law student at UVA. When his family lived here at Wilmington, his father had a big church downtown, and he himself, when he dropped out of UVA Law School and came back and read law on his own for about a year and a half, lived here. So he did spend some time here. I haven't seen it. My daughter has been there, but apparently the manse where they live no longer stands. They do have a historical marker for where it was, but that's where the Wilson connection. Now, I'm going to make a cultural reference to start this, which I'm delighted to see, frankly, that this is more like my age cohort, so that I can be a little more confident in the cultural references I make. And I'll give you an illustration of the problem with how young they're getting, the students. 3 years ago, my first class in the semester occurred on inauguration day. And it was about 2 hours after the ceremony. And my daughter, who lives in Washington, had sent me a souvenir. I had an Obama inauguration cap, so I wore it. So I pointed this out to the class, and I said, maybe some of you are wondering how I got back here so quickly for the Obama inauguration. I just said, Mr. Scott, feed me back to Madison. Wait, I looked around and said, how many of you got that? I don't think more than a quarter. Here's the hand. So let's face it, our things that seem so recent and relevant to us, well, anyway. The cultural reference I want to make is to the 1997 movie. It's the Helen Hunt Jack Nicholson movie, As Good as It Gets. And that's what I think you could say I would say about the election of 1912. As American presidential elections go, this one I think really was, still is, as good as it gets. There are a lot of reasons for that. It's not perfect, I'll say that too. But this is an election that had 3 presidents, a past president, a current president, and a future president. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Also running was the country's most appealing radical politician, the Socialist Party presidential candidate Eugene Debs. There are other things too. There's an assassination attempt candidate. I'm going to mention that a bit later. There was a disputed convention, a convention that blew up. That's the Republican convention of 1912, which led to a walkout of Roosevelt's delegates, and a meeting where he made that great statement of his, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." things that weren't in there, too. Things that I think seem quite surprising and disturbing to us. Issues of civil rights and racial justice were not in it. There were reasons for it, not good reasons, but there were reasons. Maybe some questions afterward, I'd be glad to talk about that. Issues involving gender were not there much either. Women's suffrage played a very slight role in it. I'll mention that, but it was a slight role. That's just the background. And I always said this was the dog that didn't bark in the night. This is 1912. Remember what happened 2 years later. The biggest thing, in some ways, one of the biggest events of the 20th century in world history, World War I. Foreign policy never figured in this. Once, just once, in passing, in one of these speeches, Theodore Roosevelt made some reference to foreign policy. Other than that, it's just a non-issue. Interestingly enough, by the way, in 1936, just 3 years before World War II broke out, foreign policy was not part of that election. It's very interesting how these things come together. What I'd like to talk to you about, though, is really what everybody agreed was the main event, which was Theodore Roosevelt versus Woodrow Wilson. This really was the center ring of this great electoral circus. And what it did was it pitted the most colorful presidential politician since Andrew Jackson against the most articulate presidential politician since Thomas Jefferson. Now, it started out with this race between the two men started out with, oddly enough, on the same day, because they accepted their respective parties' nominations on the same day, that was August 7, 1912. Theodore Roosevelt accepted it at his convention. This was the Progressive Party. And their convention struck some people who saw it as more like a religious revival meeting than a political conclave. The delegates sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers" and the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and they even had special words set to the tune of the doxology. And Roosevelt broke precedent by appearing in person to speak at the convention, to accept the nomination. The first major party candidate to do that would be 20 years later. Somebody else named Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing. Well, there are family connections there, which I will mention later on, too. And he delivered his speech that he delivered, appropriately for this quasi-religious enclave, is called a Confession of Faith. And in that, he denounced the Republicans. He bolted the Republican Party to form this new party. He denounced them as hidebound reactionaries, and he also denounced Professor Wilson and the Democrats as wedded to an archaic construction of the states' right doctrine and quack economic remedies. He also rejected what he calls class government by the rich few and the needy many, whereas what the country really needed was a transcendent vision of the national interest, which would give the right trend to our democracy, a trend which will take it away from mere greedy, short-sighted materialism. And he closed this by repeating his famous cry, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." Powerful stuff. Woodrow Wilson did the old-fashioned way. He observed this outmoded formality of waiting for a delegation to come a couple of 2, 3, 4 weeks after the convention to inform the nominee that he'd gotten the nomination. And in speaking then, supposedly, I'm so surprised that he had his remarks delivered. And he also gave a strongly progressive message. He said, "We stand in the presence of an awakened nation, impatient of partisan make-believe. The nation has awakened to a sense of neglected ideas and neglected duties, to a consciousness that the rank and file of our people find life very hard to sustain, that our young men find opportunity embarrassed." He touched on major issues, particularly the big issue, the Civil War, was the trusts, big business. He said, big business is not dangerous because it is big, but because its bigness is an unwholesome inflation created by privileges and exemptions which it ought not to enjoy. He said he wanted new, exacting laws to reinvigorate competition and arrest and prevent monopoly. And he closed by saying, we represent the desire to set up unentangled government, a government which will not tolerate the use of the organization of a great party to serve the personal aims and ambitions of any individual, and it will not permit legislation to be employed to further any private interest. Now, notice that slam at the personal aims and ambitions. Wilson was taking a shot at Roosevelt. In fact, they've both been taking each other's measure and looking for ways to attack the other. Several times during the year leading up to this, some of Roosevelt's friends and even his oldest son had suggested to him that Wilson might offer a pretty good alternative to Taft and their own party's conservatives. Well, Theodore Roosevelt would have none of that. He dismissed the Democrats as hopeless because even those among them who are not foolish, like Woodrow Wilson, are not sincere, but are playing politics for advantage, and are quite capable of tricking the progressives by leading them into a quarrel over states' rights against national duties. Wilson, on the other hand, had often praised Roosevelt, despite that slam at his supposed egotism. In particular, he had praised Roosevelt's espousal of what Roosevelt called the new nationalism. Theodore Roosevelt's great slogan. And Wilson has said the new nationalism means something. It means that if states cannot perform certain things, we will have to look to the federal government to do the reforming for us. We talk about centralization of power, and we say that we are jealous of federal power. Well, somebody has got to furnish the power. At the end of 1911, it's beginning to look as if maybe he and Roosevelt would be opponents in the presidential election. And Wilson told a friend, that would make the campaign worthwhile. Okay, I want to win the opponent. They weren't too quick to attack each other. One thing, Roosevelt had the problem of building a new party from scratch. Wilson, on the other hand, had an established party behind him and one spell of victory. Wilson knew, even with that advantage, that he faced a real challenge. He said to one friend, do not be too confident of the result. I feel that Roosevelt's strength is altogether incalculable. He appeals to their people's imaginations. I do not. He is a real, vivid person for whom they have seen and shouted themselves hoarse over and voted for, big and strong. I am a vague, conjectural personality, made up more of opinions and academic prepossessions than of human traits of red corpuscles. We shall see what will happen. By the way, he wasn't discouraged by that, because he said, also, none of this daunts me or makes me hesitate. And certainly, there will never be more fine elements or powerful elements of public opinion to use to save one's heart by. It would be a splendid adventure, and it would make me solemnly glad to undertake it. Solemnly glad. Well, Wilson's ideas of how he wanted to run for president, that is to enlighten public opinion, and to have a great discussion, got a powerful enforcement when somebody he had not met before came to see him at the end of August 1912. This was the well-known People's Attorney and reformer from Boston, Louis Brandeis. Brandeis was a fierce opponent of the trusts, and he was appalled by the stand that Roosevelt had taken and then forced on the new Progressive Party, which was in favor of regulating rather than breaking up the trusts. Wilson and Brandeis had a 3-hour talk, and they claimed that they had a meeting of the minds. Wilson said, both of us have as the object the prevention of monopoly. Monopoly is created by unregulated competition, and the only way to enjoy industrial freedom is to destroy that condition. Wilson continued on his plan of attack, and he made his first major speech in the campaign after accepting the nomination. At a Labor Day rally in Buffalo, he commended what he called the social program of Roosevelt's new party, the bringing about of social justice here, there, and elsewhere. But there was a central method, a central purpose in that platform from which I very seriously dissent. Did this new party want to break up monopolies? Not at all. It proposes to legalize them. It proposes that they shall be accepted and regulated. And that looks to me like a consummation of the partnership between monopoly and government. Because once government regulates the monopoly, then the monopoly will see to it that it regulates the government. Wilson also rejected the Roosevelt's program on deeper grounds. He said for himself, I do not propose acting as a providence for you. I want to say frankly that I am not big enough to play providence. And my objection to the other program is that I don't believe there is any other man that is big enough to play providence. He said he feared a government of experts. God forbid that in a democratic country we should resign that task and give the government over to experts. Because if we don't understand the job, we are not. Well, that last objection hinted at another of Roosevelt's political points. A lot of people worried that this guy was a power-hungry potential despot. And that was Wilson was hitting it back. He also answered a charge against himself, which you notice Roosevelt had scoffed at Professor Wilson. This was a charge that he was, folks here I think will like this, that he was considered disqualified for politics because I was a school teacher. But there is one thing a school teacher learns that he never forgets, namely that it is his business to learn all he can and then communicate it to others. Now, I consider this my function. Well, Roosevelt didn't take these charges lying down. He shot back that the last 2 decades' attempts to break up the trusts had failed. And he quoted a celebrated remark by the greatest trust magnate of them all, J.B. Morgan. You can't unscramble the eggs in an omelet. Roosevelt said, Taft tried to unscramble the eggs through antitrust prosecutions, and he failed. And now Wilson wanted to try the same futile approach. As for Wilson's aspersion on government by experts, Roosevelt scoffed at it as the exact attitude taken by the respectable ultra-conservative in matters of this nature. He extolled his own program as a definite and concrete approach to the program as opposed to Wilson's vague, puzzled, and hopeless purpose, feebly to continue the present policy. This guy could give as well as he got. Then Roosevelt went on the attack. On September 9th, Wilson gave a speech in New York that contained the sentence, "The history of liberty is a history of the limitation of governmental power, not the increase of it." Now, in the body of the speech, that statement was part of an exhortation to keep the government in touch with the people. But standing alone, the way many newspapers quoted the sentence, it seemed to show that Wilson was really a conservative, state rights, limited government Democrat. And T.R. wasted no time in exploiting this opening. He quoted that sentence and called it the key to Mr. Wilson's position, which he dismissed as a bit of outworn academic doctrine which was kept in the schoolroom and the professional study for a generation after it had been abandoned by all who had experience of actual life. It is simply the laissez-faire doctrine of English economists 3/4 of a century ago. Roosevelt proudly proclaimed his intention to use the whole power of the federal government to protect those who under Mr. Wilson's laissez-faire system are trodden down in the ferocious scrambling rush of an unregulated and purely individualistic industrialism. That counterattack actually was a favor for Wilson. When Wilson made his first extended campaign tour, which was in the Midwest, he spelled out his economic views. In Sioux City, Iowa, he said, "Now, a trust is not merely a business that has grown big. A trust is an arrangement to get rid of competition. And a big business is a business that has survived competition by conquering the field of intelligence and economy. I am for big business. I am against the trusts." But he went on to say, the third party says that trusts are inevitable, that it is the only way of efficiency. I would say parenthetically that they don't know what they are talking about. He also said, "I absolutely deny that monopoly is inevitable. I absolutely deny that we have lost the power to set ourselves free. Instead, he advocated regulated competition instead of regulated